While many liberals point to success in terms of tax cuts, supply-side reforms and free trade that came from our influence on centre-right figures like Konrad Adenauer, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, we often overlook the liberal success which has been led by the left, like drug reform, immigration reform, and equal protections under the law for LGBTQ individuals and racial minorities. Aaron, thank you very much for joining me today on episode 1 of Moral Sentiments. To start with, can you explain a little bit more in depth about what ReImagining Liberty is and why you decided to start doing it?
Sure, and thank you very much for having me on. It's a pleasure. So ReImagining Liberty is my project for essentially rethinking the way that we should approach talking about the project of political liberty, a project of advancing individual economic, social, cultural freedom. I worked in the libertarian movement for a lot of years, and there's a particular approach, there's a particular kind of rhetoric. And what I kind of came to realize over time was how much of that was deeply embedded in the right. It was drawing inspiration from the right. It was associating largely with the right. And it was tuning its rhetoric to right-leaning audiences. And in ReImagining Liberty, I am attempting to move away from that and to embrace what I think was kind of the original motivation for the broader liberty movement, which was much more of an approach of flattening hierarchies, undoing social and political and economic domination, of working towards trying to free and benefit the least privileged members of society, which ends up looking more like the kinds of projects that the left typically talks about. And while I have deep problems with the policy approaches that the left uses to advance those causes, I think there's more shared common ground than is often acknowledged. And I think the liberty movement can be more effective if it recognizes that and begins to talk more in that language of cosmopolitanism and liberation and emancipation and gets away from its kind of right-wing cultural entanglements.
Yeah, and what exactly, in your view, would this look like if everybody got on board with what you're trying to do, which I broadly agree with? If everybody did, and we did change our rhetoric, and perhaps we got a bit more appeal on the left and in the centre on the margin, eventually, what would you see it turning into? Because, as I say, the appeal that maybe we've got so far is very much at the margin. A lot of the leftists we talk to, that you talk to on ReImagining Liberty, are very much maverick in the sense that they value free speech. They properly take the time to understand liberal thought, even if they disagree with it, and they argue against and critique it properly. But that certainly doesn't encompass the majority of the left, it seems to me. Do you really think that it's likely to change anytime soon?
I don't think it's likely to achieve victory anytime soon. But I don't think that it was likely to achieve victory anytime soon in kind of the old strategic ways of doing things either. Like the struggle for liberty is a long one. And there definitely, over the course of history, there has been tremendous progress towards liberty. We are far freer today than we used to be, but we have a long way to go. So all of this is a long game. But I think that the way that this plays out in practice is in essentially undoing what I see as an asymmetry in the way that the liberty movement often thinks about divergences from our ideal. So because the liberty movement has, at least since the middle to second half of the 20th century, placed itself more on the political right, it tends to be more willing to overlook deviations from our genuine principles and commitments to liberty if they are in a rightward direction than if they are in a leftward direction. So this might be that if someone is agrees with us on a lot of issues, but is wildly opposed to immigration, or perhaps favors continuing the drug war, will kind of continue to think of them as an ally, but maybe say, hey, you should change your mind on this kind of stuff. But if there's someone in the other direction who broadly agrees with us on a wide range of policies, but they think that maybe the government should intervene in healthcare, we say no. We write that person out. Like they're a socialist. We can't deal with them. It shows up in who we invite to speak, who we work with on legislation, and so on. And so there is this kind of real asymmetry. So this isn't an argument that, generally speaking, the left is pro-liberty, because they're not. And it's not an argument that the right is always and inevitably anti-liberty, because there are obviously lots of people on the right that we could work with on a case-by-case basis. But it is a recognition that the underlying kind of values of the left in wanting like social liberation and a flattening of hierarchies and so on are not just compatible with kind of the motivating principles of, I think, a real commitment to individual liberty, but that a real commitment to individual liberty is a good way to achieve those ends. And then also that we have historically, over however many decades, been asymmetric in how in like what we're willing to put up with. So it's a recognition of values and kind of a recognition of how much we've been pulled in one direction. And maybe rhetorically, we should kind of decouple and think of ourselves a little bit more. I don't want to say down the center, because this is not a centrist position. Like, my positions are pretty radical, but not pulling ourselves all the way towards one side and not kind of being hyperbolic in our critiques of the other side.
Yeah, absolutely. But one response, I think, from the other side of this, which seeks to create a new fusionism, or at least to be friendly or in coalition and league with the right, very much above anybody on the left, with the exception of a few stragglers who might already listen to us and be friendly to some of the things we have to say. One of the objections would be, well, yeah, it might be true that conservatism as an ideology, particularly this new rather sort of reactionary, pernicious national conservatism, post-liberalism type of ideology, is just as illiberal as communism or socialism, social democracy even, but that they will give us more of a hearing. They will be more willing to be convinced, for purely the reason that on both sides of the Atlantic, although there are many differences between our two right wings, one thing they share is that they are what my colleague Christian Niemitz would call low status. They are more open to listening because they have to be. So maybe if the right were socially dominant, if they were in power, they would be just as authoritarian on things like free speech. But the point is, they're not. And people who are not in the ascendancy will often appeal to liberal principles of neutral freedom because they want their own freedom back. In that sense, given that the right has every incentive, because of their low cultural status and diminishing political status, particularly in the long run, isn't it just a fact that they'd be more willing to listen to us than people on the left who don't face the same social consequences for the views they hold?
So that's an interesting argument, but I guess I see two immediate things that strike me as implausible about it. So the first is that part of the reason that the right has been more willing to listen to libertarians or liberty advocates over the last century or half century is because that's where we have tended to put most of our effort into cultivating relationships, cultivating rhetorical connections, and in just kind of culturally placing ourselves. And that has the effect of both increasing their affinity for us, because we've been telling them we are kind of their tribe. It has had the effect of making it harder to have conversations outside of that tribe, because people coming from the left, I think, justifiably see liberty advocates as of the right, because we've been kind of telling people explicitly and implicitly for a long time that that's where we are. And so the partisan tribal animosities mean that they are less likely to talk to us. So I think that's kind of an alternative explanation. But then on the power thing, I would say, yes, the right tends to be lower social status, although not always. So one of the really interesting things that we have seen over the last 10 years is the rise of what I'll call like reactionary centrism, which is the like media elites, columnists, people we don't think of the right. They're writing for the New York Times or the Washington Post. They
I think TERFs are a good example, aren't they? In some ways, a lot of them,
yes,
their background
yes,
is
exactly. That's
center left, and yet you see them on both sides of the Atlantic, all of a sudden writing a Times column and writing about how about the trans agenda every other week type of thing.
Yes, exactly. That those kinds of right wing, they're not right wing economic values, but the right wing cultural values, I think we have found are much more prominent among elites than the typical narrative would lead you to believe. So they are much higher status than they're often interpreted as, and the right has been kind of growing in its influence and power. I mean, the United States, it has clearly risen. It took the far right, took the presidency. It might take it again. We're seeing significant crackdowns on LGBT people across the country, written into law in all sorts of really horrific ways. And these people aren't in majorities, but they certainly are exercising a lot of political power. And I think it speaks to your, like, when they were out of power, they spoke in the rhetoric of freedom. But the moment they got power, they started banning books and banning trans identities and intervening in people's healthcare choices and so on. And so to the extent that us working with these people enables them to gain more power, it seems like it's kind of at cross purposes with the long-term goal. Like if we, as liberty advocates, provide the right with rhetorically powerful arguments that they can use to gain power, but then the moment they gain power, they use it in really awful anti-liberty ways, then we basically have defeated ourselves. And again, this isn't an argument that we should never, like, if you care about liberty, you should never work with anyone on the right. Just like you should never, this is an argument that you should never work with anyone on the left. It's that we should be more open to working with people who we think are actually going to advance liberty, either in the broad sense or on like an individual, this issue versus that issue basis. And just be more willing to kind of have a clear-eyed picture of what the two sides represent. Because part of being so culturally embedded in the right is that I think that a lot of us have become blinded to just how anti-liberty the right has become. That we still want to imagine that the right is the party of kind of is like a Margaret Thatcher, who had clearly, I'm not saying Margaret Thatcher was like pro-liberty, right? But like she's very different than like kind of the populist right that we see, or that in the US that it still is the party of Reagan versus the party of Trump or something like that. Like there's that kind of wanting to hold on to this time when we imagined that this fusionist project was the right one. And I think kind of getting out of this cultural embeddedness will allow us to have a clearer-eyed picture of that. And that will adjust our thinking as kind of the relative merits of the two sides.
Yeah, so one of the arguments that I've made, we have a good internal debate on this question here at the IAS, as I imagine almost every libertarian, free market, classical liberal organization in the Western world is having at the moment. You'll have some people who are more of our view, some people who are more of the pro-fusionist view. One of the arguments I've made is that it seems that argument I just laid out for you, it seems to exist in a paradox whereby, well, on one hand, these people can be low status, they're not going to get anywhere, they're going to age out. In the UK, like unlike in the US, where religious conservatism plays much more of a part on the right. We don't really have that. Our right, particularly on social issues, is much more benign than yours. But to say that on one hand, they're benign and low status, okay, then, so why do we need to be friendly with them? It's not going to help advance our cause. Then on the other hand is, well, if these people are genuinely going to forge a movement, the movement that they're going to forge is based on the young energy on the right, I think, is very much on the authoritarian side. The electoral base of the right in the UK is quite similar to how it's developing in the United States. You have this white working class union country sort of rebellion against their centre-left ideology they've always had and moving towards the right now. I don't think in either case, if they win, they're not going to be liberal. And if they're not winning, why do we have to care about it? Do you sort of broadly agree with that? Do you think that there's maybe a sort of different angle to the left or the centre that can sort of promote our ideas towards the forefront of discussion more than there is on the right, if the right are low status indeed?
Yes, so I agree with that broadly. And I think you're absolutely right that the energy on the right, the younger generation energy, is very much in this populist, authoritarian, alt-right, kind of culturally reactionary trad direction that is not just less liberty focused than we might have imagined conservatism was at one point, but is profoundly dangerous. Like, if these people get power, they will not abide by the checks and balances that limit what you can do in government. They will seek authoritarianism. Quite a lot of them are at the very least fascist adjacent, and many of them are like explicitly fascist. Like, these are really scary movements from the perspective of liberty and autonomy and dignity and so on. As far as the left goes, I think the argument is that we are watching something of a political realignment. We are watching a reorganization of the sides in politics into something that looks like cosmopolitanism versus nativism and populism and nationalism. And those don't map perfectly to the old way of the conservatives versus progressives. But what we're finding is that progressives and the left are much more open to cosmopolitanism than the right is. They're much more open to social freedoms than the right is. They're much more open to a view of culture as a place where people can self-author, pursue their own bliss, try to build the kinds of lives that they want, and exist peacefully with each other in doing so. And they couple that to a lot of bad economic ideas. They will couple that to a lot of bad ideas about labor and so on. But that ultimate motivation of cosmopolitanism is much, much stronger on the left than it is on the right. And so I think that's what gives us the in, is that's kind of quintessentially what the liberty movement has always been about, is an open and free society where people can pursue their own ends, not as like atomized individuals, but in robust and free collaboration with each other in these really rich ways. And so we can have that kind of conversation with people, and we can say, actually, like, if you want this and I want it too, a better way to achieve it is with more freedom versus intervention. But that's a different, and I think a more fruitful conversation than having an argument with an alt-righter about whether women should be allowed to have the same kind of rights and freedoms as men, or whether, in fact, whites should dominate society and so on. Like, their fundamental end is, I think, ultimately very incompatible with robust liberty, whereas the cosmopolitan position, we can work towards common goals, even if we disagree a whole lot right now about how to get there.
So I think you're right on an ideological level that there is developing in politics now, well, redeveloping in some ways, because I think it's the way it has been in most of post-Enlightenment political history, that the left, broadly speaking, is revolutionary in some sense. That doesn't necessarily mean, throw Molotov cocktails, but, they seek change, they seek dynamism, and it's cosmopolitan. And the right is more insular, nationalistic, and reactionary, the way it used to be, the good old days in some ways. But what I struggle to agree on when it comes to the left is that cosmopolitan vision that you lay out, and you use the term, and to do so together peacefully, I think. I don't see a lot of that in the energy of the left right now. Just as the energy of the young right is very reactionary, liberal, and nasty, I think most of the energy in the young left is reactionary, illiberal, and nasty. So if yes, we could have a conversation with these people and say, okay, we broadly want to achieve similar ends: cosmopolitanism, diversity, community. We want to achieve them in different ways, though, and we think that the explanations by the likes of Don Lavoie are a much better way to go about achieving your stated goals than those of Karl Marx. But they don't want to talk, and they don't have to. There is no incentive for them to listen, because they are in movements that are, number one, culturally dominant in important centers of cultural production like universities and the elite media. And two, that they have now, for probably about a decade, been able to get away with their very liberal agendas on things like speech. So they will agree with us on gay rights, but they will try and force everybody to agree with them on gay rights. They think it's perfectly legitimate to force someone to bake the cake. They think it's perfectly legitimate to censor someone's speech when they don't like it, if it's about gay people. How do you think we can get to the point where these guys will actually listen? Or that they'll feel like there's any incentive for themselves to have a conversation with us that's serious and constructive?
It's a challenge. I don't want to minimize that. I think that part of it is, and I have been very critical of those aspects of a liberalism on the left. I tend to think of it as, it seemed like for quite a while the left had outright won the culture wars, and in the US, the Supreme Court decision on gay marriage, making gay marriage legal across the country, seemed like just kind of a final victory. And the proper response to that would have been, okay, we won from a legal sense, so now we are just going to move our attention on to other things. But for a lot of people on the left, they saw it instead as an opportunity to kind of put their boots on the necks of the wrong thinking people who had been on the other side of that issue. And so you had the compelling them to bake the cakes and the punishing them in the workforce, in the economy, for expressing views that didn't align with these left preferences. And it continues to be fairly ugly. That's changed somewhat with kind of the rise of the right in the culture war again, and the backlash against transgender identities, which is all now turned into a backlash against gay people. Like we're backtracking on acceptance of that and so on. But I think part of it is motivated by the fact that our politics is so cutthroat, is so like the two sides both just see politics as a way to crush the other. That we use, I've often referred to politics as kind of just institutionalized bullying. Like these are just the tools we use to bully each other, and we are either the bully or the victim. And as soon as the victim gains access to these tools, the victim turns around and starts bullying back. And it's psychologically, like, you can understand why, if you've been the victim for a long time and now you have the opportunity to be the bully, that looks awfully appealing. It is very tempting to use those tools to get back at the person who wronged you. And that's a difficult trap. It's like a difficult cycle to dig out of. But I think we can have these conversations. I know quite a lot of people on the left and the very far left in universities, outside of universities, who I have many and fruitful conversations with. And I think that the way that you start those conversations is by approaching the person from the perspective of first shared ends, of saying, like, look, we may disagree very deeply on this stuff, but we can find these areas of common ground and common values. And let's start there. And then also a perspective of genuinely wanting to learn from each other, because I think one of the reasons that people on the left can be so dismissive of having conversations with us is that we have a tendency to really just straw man theories coming from the left. Like, a lot of really dumb stuff has been written about feminism or critical race theory that's clearly written by people who don't know anything about it, but just have kind of heard from other people in their tribes that it's stupid, and so assume that it's stupid, and so on. And if you come at it from that perspective of like, I've already decided everything that you believe is dumb, now let's have a conversation. Well, clearly that conversation is not going to get off the ground.
Owning
and
the
so
lib.
approaching it like, yes, if all you want to do is own the libs, then the libs aren't really going to have a talk with you, justifiably so. And so I think instead just saying, like, I want to learn from you, and we're going to disagree about a lot, but let's have like a respectful conversation. In my experience, you can have all sorts of fruitful conversations that way, but it can't be begun from the point of view of like, I am going to crush you, or you are an immediate threat that needs to be destroyed or refuted. But instead, we disagree on a lot, but we can find areas to agree, and let's have a conversation. And that's the same way you can have a conversation with someone on the right. But I think we tend instead to start every conversation from the perspective of, I am going to defeat you. And that obviously doesn't lead to productive talks.
Absolutely. And the sort of final point I want to ask you about is, well, what comes next? We know what we're against. We know what we think perhaps the liberal and libertarian movements have done wrong in the past by being too friendly with the right, not friendly, or at least open enough with people who aren't on the right. But what are some of the issues that perhaps we haven't talked about enough, and as good liberals, we should have been talking about just as a matter of principle? But also, in terms of the argument you're making, you think there is also strategic value to being more principally liberal, particularly on certain social issues. What exactly are those issues for you? Because on something like immigration, for example, you would agree both have an open borders position, but that's incredibly unpopular. Basically, no one wants that, and even most people that want that definitely don't focus on that as their main point, because then they're probably not going to get anywhere anytime soon. But where are some of those issues where both we should talk about it on principle, like with immigration, but also where there's strategic value, where we can really get somewhere with people outside of the right?
So immigration is an interesting one, because it is true that most people, if you start with open borders, are not going to be on board. But most people are much more open to immigration than one might think. Pro-immigration sentiments in the US continue to rise. They reached, I think, the highest that they've ever been at the height of Trump's anti-immigration rhetoric. People are really turned off by really restrictionist views. And so we can kind of have those conversations. I think that one thing we need to do is the economic side. There's a tendency to focus very much on the economic side of policy issues, and to say, well, the reason we should be pro-immigration is because it's good for the economy. It grows the economy, it fills jobs, and so on. And that is all like absolutely true. And that we shouldn't pretend that's not the case. We shouldn't stop talking about that stuff. But there's also a lot to be said for immigration from just it is humane to let these people in. That as we're recording this morning, the New York Times published an expose on the Greece has been rounding up immigrants as they come in on the boats and basically putting them back on a boat, taking them out to sea, putting them on a raft, and leaving them there. Presumably a lot of them to die. And there's video footage, including babies being put onto these rafts. It's horrific stuff, right? And it's not, the argument against doing that is not, well, these immigrants would have been good for the economy, they should have let them in, right? It is that this is profoundly inhumane. This is just devastating a marginalized group that is powerless, that, you know, so like making that part of our arguments is a big part of it. On specific issues, I think part of it is not shying away from the issues that upset our friends on the right. So I have been disappointed by how many libertarian organizations have been largely silent on anti-transgender laws that are the government getting involved in healthcare decisions, which is the kind of thing that libertarians criticize all the time, but they haven't had a lot to say about that. They haven't had a lot to say about crackdowns on what gets taught in schools, if those things are things that offend conservatives. So book bans of books about gay and transgender kids. And we know from polling that most people do not have the far reactionary views that conservative politicians are implementing through law on these matters. And so getting involved in those kinds of things and picking those strategies that I think cut against the narrative of the liberty movement being on the right, because part of the problem we run into with growing into these other areas is that people assume that we are on the right, and these people themselves are not on the right. So what would they want to have to do with us? And so if we can be really out front on these kinds of issues, where I think there is a lot of possibility for immediate political change in a positive direction, just like when we got involved in the drug war, you know, like we were way out in front on the drug war, and there has been dramatic improvement. There still is a long way to go, but things have gotten a lot better. Or gay marriage, or police misconduct, like reform of criminal justice system. This is another area where I think we have incredibly powerful arguments and a real track record of a principled commitment to this stuff. And so rhetorically elevating those kinds of issues starts to cut against the narrative of being just kind of right-wingers who are maybe even more free markets than conservatives say they are. So those are the kinds of issues that I think focusing on them has the possibility for immediate change, but also has this kind of knock-on effect of showing that we are not just right-wingers, but share these common values. And so over time, I think that will attract more of that young political energy to our approach to solving those problems in this humane and cosmopolitan way versus more intervention and the kind of bad habits of the left.
Excellent. Well, Aaron Ross Powell, thank you very much for joining me for the first episode of Moral Sentiments. What do you think? Do you think there is room for us to reach out on the left and the centre and move away from the right? Or do you think that the fusionist approach is the best hope we've got? Let me know your comments in the section down below. Give the video a like and subscribe. And next week on Moral Sentiments, we will be talking about foreign military intervention and its impact on our civil liberties at home. Thank you very much for watching.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.